Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching us today. Thank you so much for joining a very important and wonderful conversation that we're about to have. It's a Globinar on Japan, Megatrends, and a market update. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. We're really happy that you joined us from wherever you are around the world. We have three extraordinary women. They are three very experienced women who have lived in Japan for many, many years. They look much younger than their years that they put in Japan, and you'll see that in a moment. But what you'll hear from them is the kinds of information that you'll need to make decisions on your business in and out of Japan, and that's really what we're looking to do today. So I'd like to introduce the three ladies first, and then we'll begin the program. The three women start with Debbie Howard. She's the chairman at the Carter Group, Japan Market Resource Network, JMRN, and you'll see that JMRN. I didn't really realize what that stood for until today. Debbie has lived and worked in Japan for over 30 years and founded Japan Market Research Network, that acronym, JMRN, in 1989, which was actually when I lived in Japan. Debbie is a specialist in translating qualitative research into clear strategic direction for international clients. Over her career, she has worked with most major brands that have entered Japan, including facilitating executive-level ideation and strategy development for multinational companies such as Daimler Chrysler, Burberry, and American Express. Debbie has served as both president and chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, ACCJ, and she continues to serve as ACCJ President Emeritus. Our next speaker will be Deborah Hayden. She's the managing director at Finsbury. Deborah brings over 30 years experience in financial and corporate communication to Finsbury, a leading global corporate and financial communications agency. She is widely recognized expert on communications issues in Japan and across Asia. Her international experience includes being a senior advisor to the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise Beachhead Committee, which advises companies on Japan market entry. And last but not least is Catherine O'Connell. She's the founder and principal at Catherine O'Connell Law. I saw a sign behind her that she might need to explain given that information. She's lived and worked in Japan for many years and is the first foreign female lawyer to launch a law firm in Japan. As a bilingual English and Japanese lawyer, she has a deep knowledge of Japanese business, culture, and practices. She serves as vice chair of the Australian and New Zealand Chamber of Commerce in Japan, and also as legal services and IP committee chair for ACCJ. So Deborah, we're going to kick off with you. Please give us a brief outline of the current situation in Japan. The numbers of affected cases of COVID-19 and deaths are a lot lower than many other countries. And there are questions about the relatively low level of testing. Let us know more about the situation there.
Thank you very much, Doug. Really, we thought to kick off today is let's look at the numbers. The numbers don't lie. There's an awful lot of perceptions, ideas, theories about who's doing well, which country has got it right, which country hasn't. I have a lot of contacts sort of are quite concerned, say that they've heard that Tokyo is really bad. Maybe it's a pinch for media to actually show the world that Japan's not doing very well because bad news sells. Not really quite sure. But let's look at, as of yesterday, we had nearly 16,000 cases. That compares with Tennessee in the US with about 15,500. And we had to date, we've had 657 deaths, which compares with Minnesota, which is about 640. And over nearly 9,000 have recovered. So, the numbers, those are the numbers. We don't have little kind of crematoriums that are rushing through and not telling people. If you look at, say, Tokyo alone, the number of deaths in Tokyo through March were only 33,000. Now, this is 0.4% lower than the average deaths at that period. Some are saying that because of the heightened alert for COVID-19, that people are actually taking a lot more care, and there's been a lot less cases of influenza, which also, as everyone knows, has quite a high death rate. So, you know, the numbers don't lie. The hospitals are not overwhelmed. We're not getting doctors complaining or you know, crying out for help and assistance. Why is this? A lot of people are saying that the culture in Japan, we've got a very obedient culture, that although we're not in an official lockdown like many other countries, we have a state of emergency and people are taking it pretty seriously. They're not traveling, traffic is down. With the state of emergency, if you have to go to work, you still can. Tokyo and Marunouchi has seen salarymen coming in and out of their offices because of the various needs that we'll go into later, that, you know, they still need to be there. You know, restaurants are open. Hairdressers are considered essential services and are still doing their trade. But people are being very, very cautious. They're staying at home, and Japan has a history of wearing masks. We really feel that there's a lot that's been going on that's actually working. You know, overall Japan's got better health. Longevity in Japan is 85 years, which is sort of #1 in the world. And people are pretty fit and pretty healthy. We don't have the great obesity problems that is hitting a lot of Western countries. So, you know, there's a lot of factors, I think, that are actually working in Japan's favor. Given all of this, we'd like to move on to Debbie. Debbie and her team have actually dipped in and done some consumer research and actually looked into what people are thinking in this time. And the findings, actually, I think you'd be pretty surprised. Deb, over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm going to just share my screen and let me see if I can make this work. Oh no, wait. Whoops. I think that's going to work. There we go. Okay. And now I need to get the slide presenter view. Sorry, I can never make it happen. Let's see, where are we going?
Beautiful.
Is it, but I think you maybe see the side panel still, right?
Still do, yeah.
Yeah, okay, let me get the presenter view down at the bottom. The screen gets all covered up with everything on it. I'm sorry about that. There we go. There we go. Okay. All right. So thank you so much, Deborah, and all of you for being here today. I'd just like to share with you a few key results from Carter JMRN's recent quantitative study among Japanese consumers. These results are from our annual tracking study that we do every year in the spring, and the latest measurement was taken in mid-March, just prior to the announcement of the postponement of the 2020 Olympics. And of course, COVID-19 concerns were very high at that time, as they continue to be. We survey 1,000 Japanese males and females aged 15 to 69 from all over Japan. So it's a national study. This is the 4th year for the study, so it's a great chance to see consumer opinions in context and over time. Just to help set the stage, the Japanese economy in the run-up to COVID-19 was going pretty well. And there was a lot of optimism and an uplifted mood related to the World Rugby Cup in 2019 and the upcoming Olympics in 2020. So let me let you know, first of all, that there's a 40-something page deck that you can download at the end of this presentation. It'll be available on the Global Chamber website. I'm just going to give you a few key highlights that I'd like for you to keep in mind while we talk today. And this is just kind of a stage setter. So we've noticed over these 4 years of researching Japanese consumers that there are 4 macro trends shaping modern Japan. the changing world of work. This was well in place before COVID-19. We have a labor shortage in Japan, many of you may have heard about, more use of robotics over time, more diversity with women and even foreigners in the workplace. So these are all trends that are in place before COVID-19 occurs. We have increasing power and participation of women in the workforce, driven in part by necessity and with sometimes very good acceptance and sometimes less acceptance depending on the industry and that sort of thing. As Deb mentioned, we have a rapidly aging society in Japan, the most aged society in the entire world. And of course that causes some generational dynamics that are very interesting. Sometimes the generations don't see things exactly the same. And then we had an overall trend of internationalization, again, related to some extent to the World Rugby Cup in 2019 and the upcoming Olympics that were postponed, but also just a general mood and very good acceptance of foreign products overall in the Japanese market. Now, okay. And when we look at Japanese working habits, this is one of the most interesting areas for us right now, especially with the impact of COVID-19. But you can see from this chart that even before, in other words, back in 2019, way before any of us had ever heard about COVID-19, there was very strong permission and sort of a mandate among individuals saying that the world of work in Japan needed to change. We'll get into some of these factors as we go through our conversation today. And what you can see here is that it increased even more right there in mid-March when we took this measurement after COVID-19 had started. This chart, we're not going to go too much into women in the workplace today because the Global Chamber has another webinar next week on May 21st, and we'll be digging deep into females in the workplace next week. But I just wanted to show you one of my favorite charts ever. And we asked people how much they agreed with the statement, "I feel that women are making progress towards equality in society." And what's really interesting here is that men actually think there's a lot more progress being made than women do. And I always love to see that one. I just get a big kick out of that. So that's a little bit on work and women. I'd also like to share with you the opportunity areas for foreign businesses related to these 4 macro trends. So when we look at the world of work, we can see opportunities. And again, this was before COVID, but some of this and most of this carries through. Recruitment technologies, shared workspaces, telework, and management consulting. And then when we look at women power, we can see that premium categories, food, lifestyle enablement, experiential type products and experiences, and management and HR consulting, mostly related to diversity. Under internationalization, of course, tourism inbound and outbound has been greatly affected by COVID-19, but we expect that will pick back up, and certainly it was going great guns before COVID-19. English training and the financial sector, we find that Japanese consumers are becoming even more open-minded towards foreign financial and insurance products over the years. And with generational dynamics, premium foods, enhanced life support services for both aging people and those who care for them, and aging tech such as robotics for the household and smart homes and that sort of thing. So those are some of the key trends right now. Again, there's a 40-something page deck that you'll be able to download at the end of this webinar, Globinar. And I also wanted, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't want to share those yet. That's pretty much what I had to share with you before we move into the main part of our discussion. So Doug, I'd like to turn it back over to you now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great foundation for our discussion. I want to communicate to everybody that these ladies, I think, are the most organized group of speakers we've ever had by far. So I would say right now that based on that, we should have 10 to 15 minutes of time for Q&A. So continue to ask your questions online. And if we don't get to it, we handle it offline and we cover that either directly or in a blog post. So feel free to ask questions along the way. You're going to get a lot of really good information. So ask away. Let's next talk a bit about the Japanese attitudes toward working. We have members all over the world having to adapt to teleworking and work from home strategies. And I'm wondering how Japan is adapting in this area. This question goes to Deborah. How fast is the uptake of WFH, work from home, in large companies? Oh, Deborah, are you there? Are you unmuted?
Yes, apologies for that. It's teleworking, as the Japanese sort of call it. There's a question that's already come through actually on this very topic, and you're right, Emmy, is when we kicked off, people estimate that only 10% of Japanese companies were actually sort of in a position to be able to telework. Anecdotally, we know of very large Japanese companies where it was suddenly like, good heavens, the government's declaring a state of emergency, we've all got to work from home. And it was the sort of post-menopausal 50-year-old sort of buchos at Japanese companies that were like, what am I going to do at home? They weren't able to work. They did give people tablets, but the connection times back to their servers, they didn't even have a VPN, was ridiculous. So people were, renewing their Netflix subscriptions and getting out the exercise bike that was sort of gathering dust in the cupboards and getting back to their fitness. But it's when, as you all know, Japan is a very high contextual society. Presenteeism almost counts for more than productivity. But when Japan has to actually change and shift gear, it's a bit of a juggernaut and it takes a bit of time to get that around the corner, but it does change quite quickly and it changes uniquely. It adopts what it thinks is right for Japan and it does it in a very unique way. This very same company that I was just sort of referring to before, the IT people have been working overtime, and in the 1.5 months that we've had since the state of emergency was implemented, they've actually managed to turn around, give everybody connections, whether they're on Macintosh or PC, to the server. They've upgraded everything. And now these 50-year-olds have found Zoom. They are doing video conferences from morning to night and have adopted it all with alacrity. I think we're going to see a big change. Debbie's research pointed out that people are looking for a different way to work. People are finding different ways to connect and communicate. And what I'm finding from the communications industry is people are actually having to communicate more. People are having to explain things better than they would do from the usual osmosis that you find when you're in the office. And I believe from what I've been watching, the companies I've been interacting with, that we're going to see a big change. Recently, we did a pitch for some communications work with a very large, very stuffy Japanese company. And they were all at home on Zoom and actually able to do this. There was a little bit of technical difficulties. The senior guy sort of, got lost and, like me, forgot about the mute button. But it was unfounded. Normally we'd have to have shown up all in our suits and a line and numbers and, sat there and did the presentation thing. But this is really changing. Experts have estimated that companies are actually spending a lot more on renting computers so that people can actually take PCs home. There's been a big surge in purchasing of equipment to allow teleworking. You cannot get a camcorder anywhere. And I think we're going to see a big change. I'm sure it'll be interesting. SMEs probably even more so. Catherine, you've got a lot of interesting stuff to talk about on that.
Yeah, Catherine, I think you've got a view of what's happening at the SMEs. It's a little bit, to me, surprising that the big firms are making so much progress. That's very exciting. How about the SMEs?
You're on mute too.
There we go. No matter how proficient you are, you always forget the mute button. Yes. So Globinar attendees today may not be aware that SMEs are actually the backbone of Japan's society and economy. According to the Trade Ministry here, SMEs account for over 90% of businesses and employ over 70% of employees. So that's just an interesting fact to throw out at the beginning there. You know, their mum and dad shops, the whole scale of small welding and fitter and turner kinds of industries, tiny bars and cafe owners, sushi shops, of course, right through to those who are operating tech startups, app designers and projection mapping SMEs. So they really are the cornerstone of Japan. And in my sector, law, obviously international law firms are here, but the majority of law firms in Japan employ under 20 people. So they fall into the SME bucket, just like myself. I remember going off to the bank when I set up my law firm, and the bank manager said to me, "You're just like a ramen noodle shop." And I was quite offended at that at the time, but I realized, yes, I'm in the SME bucket. So I proudly own that now. So on IT, Deb's already alerted to that, but SMEs tended to fall into two buckets in my book. There were those who had the infrastructure for IT there, and those who didn't. So the ones that did have it, like Deb has said, but in a little bit differently, they didn't have the culture around working at home. So the other side of the bucket, they didn't have the culture or the IT. So one of my clients, I consistently get emails from him at 1 to 3 a.m. in the morning. He has no bandwidth online during the day, so he's adopted a night owl approach to work, and I hear from him during the night. I don't answer to him at that time, just saying. The uptake on work from home, when I first talked to SMEs, they were saying around 50% of their staff had gone home in the start of March. And then when the state of emergency was announced, that ramped up to around 70 or 80%. The tricky thing was that nobody really had work from home policies. So many employees were hurried into this work from home status, and companies have rules of employment here. And they had to they have to state the start and finish times for employees. So they had to move quickly to massage those policies and also do training for the employees and the managers how to actually work together on online platforms. There's also measures put in place with preventing people working longer hours. That can be a big problem in Japan, especially working remotely. So, you know, they have to get permission to do overtime or work late and those kinds of things. Employees are getting alerts if they're working beyond the hours that they're supposed to be working. As many of you know, if you've been doing business with Japan, Japan is fraught with manual processes here. So many people, well, I would say around 10% of the SMEs have still been going into the office. That's because they do a lot of their paperwork, paying employees or paying outsourced workers manually, not digitally. And so again, also banks, you know, their payments are not always auto payments. Someone will trot down to the bank and pay it over the counter. One of the difficulties I'd love to go into, because it's one of my pet subjects, is the hanko and the stamping process of getting approvals within companies. And at SME level, that has also been a problem. But I think even our Prime Minister, Mr. Abe, has spoken about this and is looking to having that kind of process eradicated. So if we don't see that in the future, I will be very happy about that as an SME. Some bright spots.
Machines, though, Catherine, are doing overtime.
Yes. You know, the banks are having it very difficult. You know, they can't. I talked to a lady who works at a bank yesterday, And she said that they can't really work from home. They're doing work from home on holiday, enforced paid holidays. They can't take the confidentiality out of the bank to their operating systems at the moment. Bright spots, Doug, I'd like to tell you about. Some employers have been extremely helpful for the employees. Office chairs, for example, that used to sit in at the office. One company I talked to got their office chairs delivered to every employee at home. So instead of them working out of their dining room chair, they're actually on their own chair that they're used to. One firm also had a 20% cut in their salaries, and they put that into a hardship and well-being fund for their employees. And employees can dip into that as a gift. They don't have to, it's not a loan, they can just go to that if they need to. And so just to wrap up on that one, I've had people talk about positive work from home experiences. One CEO said to me yesterday, it's been fantastic, especially those who said that couldn't be done before. They've had their hand forced to do this and have been really working well, doing town hall meetings. Families have been joining the live town halls. And I just want to mention a really big surprise to me was the overwhelming positivity of dads. You know, we're talking about women equality. I'm talking about dad equality at home. Dad's really enjoying this hybrid working space. They want to do it when they go back, and they value their family much, much more than they did before. So I think there's a big optimism here, and I really feel that SMEs are small in number, but they are, they're small in size, but they're big in number. So I do hope that they're going to be able to show the corporates the way as to how to do hybrid working from home in the future. And finally, to finish off on these comments, Doug, I'm seeing a turn now for people to be thinking about returning to work. 37 out of the 42 prefectures in Japan have opened up, eased the state of emergency from today. It's Friday the 15th of May here. And so now the smaller companies are looking at the design of the future post-COVID working office, checkerboard seating, all those kinds of things. So, I've heard that one company is delaying until a vaccine has been announced, but most of the other companies are thinking about a safe way to return to work for their employees.
Just to add to that, Catherine, I think there's a huge amount of opportunities here for forward-looking companies wanting to do business with Japan. Office design, Catherine just touched on. I know companies that are already looking up, okay, how are we going to redo our offices? A lot of the offices that were planning on big moves on real estate and things like that, they're still going ahead. There's very little sort of movement that's been cancelled. The bad news from the real estate companies is rents aren't going to go down hugely, unfortunately. But they do see a little bit of a drop, but they don't see a huge amount of drop because there's a huge demand for space. There's going to be a lot of people looking at technology, and I think that's going to be a big winner as we go forward. We have a couple of clients in the tech space that actually have remote software capabilities and remote working capabilities. The inquiries they've had are off the charts, and there's a lot of interest. The media is really focusing on this kind of thing and trying to get out the story like, here's another way of doing it, rather than the traditional approach. And I think, Japan, as everyone knows, they think of it as a sort of technology-rich company, but actually leveraging the technology is something that's been quite challenging. And there's a lot out there now that's saying, hang on, we need to look at a more sensible way of working. And I really do think that there will be changes. It might not be kind of an absolute tsunami of change, but I do think the pond's going to be filling up slowly.
Yeah.
And
I'd like to add that I've even heard companies who have now learned they don't need as much space think about reducing their workspace. So that may not be so good for the renters, but I mean the people who rent the buildings, but I think it's good for the companies.
No doubt. How has Carter JMRN handled it? Is it consistent with what we've heard here?
Yes, thank you for asking, Doug. Yeah, we've gone to almost entirely work from home. And of course, our business is interfacing with consumers pretty much face to face all the time. And we've shifted to doing a lot of our research online. So we've got people working from home. We're doing a lot of Zoom meetings, WebEx meetings to stay in touch. We have weekly management and staff meetings. And it's all working fairly well. It was a little rocky. Last night we had to shift from Teams to Zoom because somehow the connection was wonky and it was fine on one and not on the other. But everybody's been really cooperative, and it's been a really good experience.
Very good. Well, let's shift gears a bit now and talk about the impact that COVID-19 has had actually on the market and on business. And so I'd like to turn it back over to Deborah and ask you to tell us a bit about what's happening with business at the large corporate level in Japan.
Thanks, Doug. And there's obviously Japan is pretty much like what we're seeing in countries all around the world. Massive retail slump, 4.6 year on year in March. In retail sales due to the lower demand for general merchandise. On the news the other day, they were interviewing someone that was sort of ran an online business importing foreign clothes. And he said, absolutely gone down, but he's reinvented himself and is actually doing a new line in what men should wear when they're teleworking. And here's the kind of jacket that you can put on quickly when you've got to suddenly jump on that call. So, we're seeing innovations coming through. Basically, the fall has been lower than when they raised the consumption tax to 10% last October. And it's been quite severe. Nomura Research Institute expects about 10 trillion yen. That's about dollars, gosh, take away 2 zeros, probably about 100 billion in lost consumer sales. So, that's a big hole. GDP, the IMF is forecasting Japan's GDP to shrink by about 5.2% to 2020. But, given that, 2018, we grew by 0.3 and 0.7 in 2019, and we're obviously also seeing big falls in China. So, we're not alone. They don't think that pre-COVID-19 levels will be reached till 2022. So we've got, a couple of tough years ahead. Unemployment is expected to double. The rate has moved up to 2.5%, which equates to about, almost 2 million people, which is when you see the US figures, 36 million. And it's expected to go to 5%. When you look at sort of the US, which is 14.7. So that's quite a lot. And you also have to think that 2/3 of Japanese listed companies rely on, for their profits, rely on overseas trade. So the fact that other markets are still closed or challenged, all of this is going to have an impact. That's the kind of a very rough snapshot of the macroeconomics behind all of this. But, don't forget, Japanese companies are in it for the long run. They have massive powers of endurance. Although to the bane of foreign investors and particularly activists, Japanese companies are notorious for sitting on massive piles of cash. All listed Japanese companies at the end of fiscal 2018 were sitting on $4 trillion of cash on their balance sheets. When you look at listed companies at the moment, 33% of Japanese listed companies are net cash. When you compare that to Germany, which is, 52% in Japan, 33% in Germany, and 14% in the US. So we've got a lot of companies here that are sitting on cash, and they're feeling quite confident now and finding it's a sales point with international investors saying, we've got plenty of cash, we can weather this storm. The activists, I think, are left scratching their heads. It's a really interesting comparison, and I think this has given people a big foundation to be able to do some of the things that Catherine was talking about, providing funds, maintaining employment. The government has put aside a very significant rescue package of, again, sort of, about $100 billion, largely for companies that are having cash flow issues. Banks are being quite innovative in the financing. We're seeing MUFJ, Japan's largest bank, coming out with special corona bonds that are actually earmarked for particularly SMEs. So we're seeing quite a lot. Results season is upon us. As you all know, Japanese companies all have a fiscal year that pretty much ends in March 31st, and now is the time when you see corporate earnings. A number of companies have actually delayed their forecasts and their earnings due to the turmoil in March and April of getting everything together. And many are not releasing the forecasts for 2020 at all, just due to the uncertainties. By mid-April, 217 companies had given downward forecasts due to COVID-19. And retail obviously is expecting, big losses. But, there are bright spots. Toyota announced this week, they announced their earnings for fiscal 2019, but they expect an 80% drop in their operating income this year, as the virus impacts not just demand, because we've got a lot of dealerships closed, but and that's around the world. That's not just in Japan only. But they've had to mothball plants, and the big challenge is the supply chain. And I think there's a lot of talk in international publications of looking at supply chains again and the merits of outsourcing. Perhaps it's time to start bringing work home again. So, that's going to create employment and cause a big rethink in how companies work. Curiously, Toyota didn't actually cut R&D spending at all, which I think is actually quite interesting in this time, and it seems to be a bit of an outlier amongst the auto industry. And, Akio Toyoda, though, he did say he expects sales to recover by 2021, which is pretty fast. But he has said that the impact of COVID-19 is he expects it to be far greater than the global financial crisis. The biggest area, obviously, of impact is clearly tourism, as I think in every country we're seeing around the world. Overseas arrivals dropped 93% year on year in March. And foreign visitors, we think, for the whole year will decline anywhere between 30% to 80% for the whole year. Debbie referred earlier to the Olympics postponement. A lot of people have been, speculating that the state of emergency was put in late because they were hoping that the Olympics would go ahead. This is not true. They were simply watching and waiting and trying to do the right thing. And a lot of the communications around the Olympics had to be led by the IOC, who have their own priorities. It wasn't Japan. It wasn't Japan's decision. So what we've seen is that it's been delayed till 2021. There's all sorts of speculation around about why and how and when it will reopen. But we know that there is a cost to postpone it. It's estimated to be about $2.8 billion. And, who exactly does pay, we're not sure. People are sort of wondering on the impact, but I'd like to paraphrase Jesper Cole, the former chief economist of JP Morgan, now head of his own research firm. And he says, in a $5.2 trillion economy, the cost of postponing the Olympics, it's a rounding error. So something I think people are hanging on the messages that perhaps have international resonance, but a lot of these I think are a little bit out of proportion. Obviously, airlines and the rail networks, everyone is down, and a lot of the tourism industry that had been doing a big push for international inbound tourism are actually refocusing their marketing strategies and actually looking for domestic tourists and domestic travel industry instead. It's a bit of a snapshot, but I think it's a different perspective in the SMEs and some of the other companies in Japan. Back to you, Doug.
Thank you, Deborah. Catherine, what's the view with the SMEs?
Yeah, as I said, 90% of business in Japan is SME sized, and just picking up on that tourism point, that Deb's mentioned, many Airbnb owners in Japan were SME size, and they've gone under, they're very seriously affected. Some have innovated and offering their spaces that they had for work at home, for people who want to work at home but don't really want to be at home, so they're using those spaces. I think an ominous sign of what lies ahead is the number of bankruptcies that have been steadily creeping higher. As at April 24th, the reported bankruptcies was at 93, and as at 2 days ago, May 13, that rose to 143 companies that have gone belly up. So as I say, these are reported, so the actual numbers are definitely higher than that. SMEs are asking for deferral of payments, and I have heard that some are asking till 2021 for deferrals. Others want to split payments over 3 to 4 months. I spoke to a recruiter firm last week, and they told me that there's a real loss of candidate confidence, and people are wanting to stay put for their stability. A few people, actually more than a few, tendered their resignations in February. Obviously, starting of the new working year in Japan is April, and so they tendered their resignation, but then the offer that they received from their new company had been rescinded because of COVID. So, you know, as a result of that, though, the bright side of it is that there's more openings now for part-time workers and contract workers. That's good for me. I employ part-time lawyers in my business, so I'm hoping to see some more talent coming my way. Just some surveys that have been in the market, Doug, around this, and let me just refer to those because they're quite useful to back up what we are speaking about. There was a survey in the Japan Times newspaper this week that reported before the state of emergency, they surveyed 7,300 people who managed companies with 300 employees or less. So that's the SME group. Nearly 60% of those companies said that they will be able to survive COVID-19. So they will be able to survive, and the related business shutdowns, which was surprising for me to see. That's if the pandemic ends within 2 to 3 months, right? 25% of that survey respondents said that they were confident their businesses would not be affected, even if the virus continued into 2021. Perhaps these were early statistics before things happening now, but it was interesting at that point to take those responses from the SMEs. Another recent Asia business survey I read surveyed a range of entrepreneurs, business leaders in Japan and the smaller area. And they sort of said their sentiment of the market from 1 being pessimistic through to 10 being optimistic, with an average coming out there at 4.3, which is not surprising on the pessimistic side a little, but not dire, I would think. So the greatest concern from that particular survey was cash flow. Typically, SMEs here have 30 to 60 days available. The second concern was income and sales. The third concern, health and safety of employees. And fourth was supply chains. JETRO, who many of you will be familiar with, the Japan External Trade Organization, also did a survey in April of the foreign affiliated SMEs in Japan. And not unsurprising to me, given with both Deb and Debbie, we're in the American chamber, we're hearing this all the time, upwards of 93% of foreign SMEs are saying there is a big decrease in demand, sales orders, they're less than enthusiastic about expanding business right now. As Deb pointed out, that amazing figure of that's $4 trillion of cash that's coming into the market from the Japanese government. I believe they've been very fast to introduce a range of measures to help SMEs and sole proprietors. I know of literally a dozen SMEs personally who've applied for those loans and subsidies already. Information in Japanese, it's been quite cumbersome. The form filling has been quite time consuming. But again, the Chambers of Commerce here are helping with converting that information into English. And so people are getting that information readily. One of my clients who's in a tutoring service, they've gone fully digital and they've used the loans to help with the IT aspect because there's a loan for IT. And so they're diversifying their services in that way. So I'll pause there for a moment, though.
Is there anything you're seeing in these trends?
Yeah, I think if I carry on then, trends, mostly optimistic. I would say sunny with a little bit of a cloudy outlook on the old forecast. It's not just a temporary adjustment. I really feel there's an overwhelming feeling here that there will be permanent changes to the business model. For instance, you know, permanent changes to technology, we've touched on that. Definitely work from home, moving away from offline to online. In one of those surveys I mentioned, 73% of surveyed people said that they think there would be a permanent change to working from home and a shift to online.
Just to talk about the larger companies, the government has been trying to encourage better use of technology. It has been looking to the future. You know, one of the questions is about smart city development in Japan. I do, you know, the Olympics, Tokyo particularly was trying to use that to actually showcase a lot of the innovations, you know, transportation, changes to hydrogen, using hydrogen technology. A lot of these things that were, you know, beginnings of smart technology were actually wanting to be showcased, and we'll see that come out next year, I think, when they have the Olympics. A lot of the big housing manufacturers are actually moving to the use of smart technology in homes. You can get homes now where the windows automatically adjust depending on which way the wind's blowing. There's a big push and a lot of interest in smart city development. I think we're going to see, as a result of actually forcing companies' hands to actually realize it wasn't as difficult as they thought, and they didn't have to be as married to the antediluvian systems that many companies had. I believe, I echo Catherine's points. There'll be a lot of pain. There'll be some challenges, but Japan's great of pulling together in the society and actually, you know, helping as a society to get through these problems. I'm also optimistic.
Gambarimashou. So a lot of optimism, a lot of hanging in there. Debbie, back to you. What does Carter JMRN's research show about this optimism that seems to be brewing?
Thanks, Doug. Actually, the data looks pretty good and optimistic itself. Optimism was relatively strong going into COVID-19, with 19% of those surveyed being strongly positive or more positive, and that dipped to 8% in the measurement in mid-March. So not surprising that you know, we might see a notable downturn in consumer optimism at that time. But I think the really good point is that we do ask people about how confident they are about their future condition in life. And about 1/3 of those surveyed strongly or somewhat agreed that they felt optimistic about the future at the mid-March point. And when we asked them about projected spending, which we always do, we had over 1/3 projecting they'd spend a lot or little more in 1 year, and also 2 to 5 years from now. So I think the optimism is definitely there.
Okay. Catherine, how about the legal sector?
You're on mute.
There we go again. Yes, trends in the legal sector. Well, I have heard overseas firms are really struggling, and there's been lots of salary cuts and benefit cuts and furloughs and layoffs. But in contrast here, when I've talked to my big law friends, they are saying that's not the case. Lots of legal issues bubbling up, and they're busy working as usual. As you know, lawyers can be very slow to change. They're very reliant on face-to-face meetings, got to meet the client in person. But I've been teaming up with lots of lawyers through the Chamber of Commerce and by myself, doing online webinars, hence the sign in the background there. If you've stayed long enough till now, you know the answer. I've been doing this, talking with other lawyers and myself on labour law challenges, commercial contract issues, supply chain logistics issues, and at the beginning we had a lot of force majeure topics come up. So my lawyer friends have surprisingly warmed up to doing things a little bit differently, and I'm really glad to see that. An interesting point here too, overseas I know lots of law courts have gone online, and I do believe that's the future of law in the court. it will be online. But in Japan, courts have really struggled to hold trials online because they're an enclosed space. They can't be postponed because that's a breach of human rights in Japan. And also the Constitution of Japan states that trials must be held in open court. So courts have really had to also be quite agile and move to having, you know, changing the way they do things. So some of them have reduced capacity in the court. They've had a recent case, they only had 5 people in the court, which is quite remarkable, even with including the reporters. Just on your point too that you mentioned, Deb, about Toyota and not reducing on the R&D, aligned with that, the Patent Office in Japan has enlarged the filing timeframes and given a broader interpretation to the rules. This is absolutely surprising to me because they're very rigid normally, but it's clear that there's a tie-up between getting the R&D continuing. It's really important that we don't cut the energizer of R&D and then, you know, and stop it with the Patent Office. So that's a really wonderful surprise. As I said before, labour law, those offers that have been withdrawn after the global financial crisis, there was a lot of litigation. And so I think there might be an uptick in litigation and labour issues here. And just one further comment before I go back to you, Doug, on M&A. That cash that's being held by the corporates, there's also a little bit of cash running around for the lawyers that I've been talking to as well. They're reiterating that point. They're struggling with the international ban on people going to do site inspections for M&A targets, but there is still a really decent amount of transactional work and strategic M&A happening in the areas of digital health, health tech, and also food and agri-tech. Thanks, Doug.
Catherine, just some additional comments there, particularly, you know, M&A, private equity, which, you know, has been slow to take up in Japan, are seeing a lot of opportunities here in this market. And it's not so much taking over companies, it's partnering with companies to help them as they rush to implement these new technologies, as they rush to look at new markets. So, you know, clients are telling us that there's a lot of opportunities and they're actually very busy. And one additional thing I'd like to sort of add as well, I talked earlier about the fact that, you know, so many people doing remote working is that they're actually having to explain themselves and explain and talk and communicate a little bit better about what they're doing. I am seeing in the communications public relations area a lot of inquiries and interest from companies who realize that they're in an unprecedented time and that they actually need to explain and to map their journey a lot better to bring employees on board. And as Catherine alluded to, a lot of people are finding that this new working style suits them. And companies are realizing they're having to listen to their employees. One of the recent surveys sort of found that that was written about in the press was that companies that don't actually listen to employees, that don't actually engage employees and put in these new working practices are going to find it really hard as we go forward to retain top level talent. So I think communications are going to be paid a lot more attention to rather than the usual top-down osmosis, and I think I know what I'm doing, and I think that's what he wanted me to do, so I'm doing it anyway without actually asking. You know, we've all found we have to ask questions, so maybe we're going to see a little bit of a change in corporate behavior.
Yeah, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I do want to get to a couple questions. And so one of the questions is from Emmy, who one of you referenced, regarding this remote work environment and telework. And from a standpoint of digital transformation, a couple of you have touched on that. Are there opportunities for people from outside Japan to help out and to assist in that entire process?
Just very quickly, from a big company perspective, I'd say definitely. The clients that I alluded to earlier are international firms with smart working and remote technology applications. And as I said earlier, is the inquiries they're getting at this time are off the charts. There's also a very big focus in the Japanese media and the Nikkei on, you know, smarter working better. It's not going to happen overnight. There's not going to be a sudden revolution, but with my earlier example of the very large, sort of very, very traditional Japanese company, and even the 50-year-olds are kind of have worked out how to press the Zoom button. We are going to see changes.
Yeah. And I can speak to that. We've been using multiple platforms and mixing them as well. Zoom, WebEx, Skype, they're all foreign programs. I had 70-something-year-olds joining research interviews the other day, getting them hooked up on Zoom, and they were fabulous. It was a little rocky at first, but they got on there and they did fine. And we were showing stimulus. We showed a 20-minute animatics video and had them evaluate it and give us their opinions. So I think there's a lot of adaptation and a lot of opportunity for foreign platforms because we were already involved in that moving forward. So I think we have a little bit of an edge on that.
And Doug, I'd also add that, you know, there's a lot of online pitching contests going on. So if there's anyone on the Globinar who's looking to pitch to the companies here, get them up and rocking, take on some of that 4 trillion in cash that Deb's talked about. Pitching contests are absolutely rocking. There's lots of meetup groups, membership-based groups. So this is really where e-commerce platforms are going to be on the rise, up and up. Companies are pivoting. Even the manufacturing companies here, I've heard directly, they're using the new intake of employees from April, who are the young ones, who have all this knowledge and are keen to do online and e-marketplace. So there's something to capture. And I'd take that forward if everyone's listening to that.
Fantastic.
I just want to go one step further. I'm predicting your next question from Doug as a question about online food delivery like Uber Eats in Japan. Uber was already, I mean, Ubers and taxis, just, you know, Japanese taxis were impeccable on time. They all went online ages ago. Every phone, you can get an app for taxis. You can get an app for your favorite taxis for whatever you like. And so Uber has revolutionized and woke the taxi industry up. As a result, their taxis are not doing well here, but they have actually hit a nerve on the food delivery. And this is just booming. You know, companies like Uber, like Amazon, as we're seeing everywhere else in the world, are hiring because of that. Restaurants have moved from, they are allowed to be opened. They have to close at 8 o'clock, but they've moved, even sort of, you know, top class establishments are actually now doing special takeout menus. And the delivery of that sort of food is actually booming. booming. I'm actually in the countryside at the moment, and the local restaurants here, they're actually sort of, you know, running up on their bicycles to bring me my bentos. I think this is going to be something that a lot of restaurants will factor into now, that they'll actually give people the opportunities to eat in or take out. And we're seeing, we've already got the technology to order it, and I think a lot more people are going to become competent in placing online orders. Clothing is a lot of that is going online. I think we're seeing that kind of economy emerging, as Deb referred to, getting old age pensioners on tablets to do research. It's not going to take them much to do one more click to actually place an order on something as well. So I do think that we are going to see a lot happening in the technology space.
Keep the questions coming and we'll record them. We won't have time to address them today. And Kirsty, we saw yours and some of the other questions. We'll catch those after the session. We only do have a couple minutes, so I'd like to go over to Catherine, maybe to summarize or give us maybe some key points either that we missed or that you'd like to reemphasize.
I think, you know, just on the opportunities around restaurants, my particular favorite restaurant in Tokyo is a little French bistro, and they are doing online wine sommelier courses, for example. They're also doing a system that other restaurants have caught up on, which is the pay it forward. So you actually buy a coupon or a voucher to go and dine at that restaurant in the future. these are for keeping those smaller businesses going right now so they get a cash flow, but it also gives somebody an opportunity to go and be in the restaurant later. So there's that kind of connecting with the consumer in that way is also quite innovative. There's one other small company that, you know, turned the little small soy sauce bottles from soy sauce into sanitizer. And we've seen that a lot, but to see that in Japan really quickly was great. And as you know, I mean, Japan was very selective on the borders that they closed entry to. Only about 90 countries in reality. So there's still another 100 countries or so that are open. So I think there's not so much pessimism for companies here, small and large, that, you know, the business will be opening quite fast in Japan compared to other countries. So come on over would be my message.
And definitely during the Olympics for 2021.
Sure.
Debbie, what would you like to say in wrap up? Oh, you might
You're
be
on
on
mute.
It was so good. I have a positive story as well. I always like to joke that I'm a pitchster for Japan. I have been for over 30 years, and there's a good story to tell. Short-term consumer confidence is taking a big hit, but longer term, it looks pretty good. We have digital entertainment as a big winner in the product growth area. Convenience and lifestyle products, we talked about food delivery, anything online, online training, online yoga classes. Anything online right now is a fabulous opportunity. And that whole area of wellness with supplements and health, obviously the attention towards wellness is very high right now. So I agree with Catherine and Deb, come on over, the water's fine.
Debbie Howard, Deborah Hayden, and Catherine O'Connell, it's been a pleasure getting together with you this morning, this evening, this afternoon. Really appreciate your wisdom, all this knowledge. It's really inspiring, and it's really good news. Ultimately, you've sent a very positive, optimistic message, which I think is realistic as well, based on the numbers and your understanding of the Japanese psyche that is so important to make the conclusions that you've made. We're going to wrap up right now. We will answer questions afterwards, and we'll record this and have it in a blog post likely next week. Definitely from a global chamber perspective, we have Globinars all the time. They're not always as amazing as this, but we try to do it like this every time on different topics, whether it's about specific countries or regions, or whether it's about information like women's leadership or logistics or anything related to surviving and thriving going forward. So thank you so much again for attending, and have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, ladies. Really good. Really appreciate it.